The morning the doctor arrived, the sky hung low over the estate, as if it already knew what I was about to hear. I stood by the window of my study, watching the fields sway in slow, resigned arcs. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the softness reserved for unwelcome truths. A year, maybe less, unless fate chose otherwise. I felt the weight settle quietly, not as fear, but as a cold acknowledgment of unfinished life. The estate seemed to exhale with me, its silence echoing my own. Time, once abundant, suddenly sharpened its edges, and in that moment I realized how little of myself I had truly lived. The estate has always been both my inheritance and my burden. Its corridors stretched like chapters of a book I never finished reading, each one lined with portraits of men who expected more from me than I dared to expect from myself. I walked them that morning with slower steps, noticing cracks in the walls I had overlooked for years. The workers greeted me with cautious smiles, unaware of the storm gathering behind my ribs. I wondered who would walk these halls when I no longer could. Who would care for the land, the orchards, the memories woven into every stone? Legacy, such a heavy word for a man suddenly uncertain of tomorrow. Loneliness clung to me more tightly that day, not loud or dramatic, but steady, patient. I sat at my desk, fingertips brushing the edges of old letters and unfinished plans, realizing how many pages of my life remained blank. What is a man, after all, when time calls his bluff? I felt the house watching me, as if urging me to decide what mattered before the year turned its final page. And that is when a thought began to take shape, one bold, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. A thought that would soon lead me to her. Before we delve deeper into my story, please subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The estate has always felt like an extension of my own quiet nature, a place where silence settled comfortably against the floors and whispered through the corridors. From the highest ridge, the fields look almost endless, rolling outward like thoughts I never voiced. The orchards bend with the weight of seasons long past, and the old stone walls hold the warmth of summers I barely recall. Yet beneath that beauty lies a faint chill, the kind that comes from rooms left untouched for too long. I walk these grounds as one walks through memory, carefully, reverently, afraid of disturbing something sacred. Every path seems to ask who will tread it when I am gone. Inside, the house carries a gentler melancholy. The foyer greets me with fading sunlight, catching dust that dances like forgotten hopes. My father's study remains exactly as he left it, shelves bending under the history of men who believed legacy was a duty, not a choice. I often feel their portraits watching me, their expectations stitched into every frame. Some days, I close the doors to those rooms just to breathe freely. Yet even then, their presence lingers in the quiet, reminding me that time does not wait for the hesitant. The echo of my footsteps becomes a question I no longer know how to answer. And beneath it all lies the truth I have avoided. Without an heir, the estate will fall into the hands of distant relatives who see it only as profit, not home. They hover at the edges of correspondence, sending polite but eager inquiries about my health, as if waiting for the house to loosen its grip on me. The thought unsettles me more than the doctor's words. This land deserves someone who understands its history, someone who will listen to its silence the way I have. And as that realization settles deeper into my bones, a path begins to form, one that will soon lead me to a decision I cannot postpone. The evening I accepted what must be done, the lamps flickered softly, casting long shadows across my study. I sat before a blank sheet of paper, the ink trembling at the tip of my pen, as if aware that the words I penned would alter the course of more than just my life. A marriage of convenience. There is nothing poetic about such a phrase, yet necessity rarely waits for poetry. I needed someone gentle, someone honest, someone who could carry the estate's future with dignity, The very thought felt like surrender to a fate I never imagined. But time, now my sternest teacher, left me little room for hesitation. I rehearsed the proposal in my mind, each sentence feeling both heavy and strangely fragile. How does a man offer his home, his name, and the remnants of his days to a woman he does not yet know? And how does he ask for something as profound as an heir when affection has not had the chance to bloom? My reflection in the window looked older that night, shaped more by regret than illness. Still, beneath the weight of uncertainty, a quiet resolve grew. This wasn't about convenience, it was about protecting everything entrusted to me, and perhaps finding someone who might see the parts of me I had long hidden. My search began with cautious inquiries, discreet and respectful, for I refused to treat this decision as a transaction. I sought someone whose life, like mine, had known silence and shadows, someone who understood the ache of being overlooked. The closer I came to choosing, the more my heart thudded with a mix of dread and hope. A proposal like mine was unconventional, perhaps even unwise, yet it carried the possibility of something unexpected. And as the plan took shape, one name gently surfaced, a name that would soon draw me into a story I never saw coming. I first saw her in the soft light of late afternoon, standing near the small gate at the edge of the village, her hands clasped loosely as if she were trying to anchor herself to the earth. She wore a simple dress, the kind that reveals nothing yet hides entire worlds, and her gaze lowered each time someone passed. There was a quietness about her, not the kind born from timidity, but from surviving too many unkind silences. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a depth I recognized instantly, an unspoken ache wrapped in grace. It felt as though the world paused long enough for me to wonder how such a presence had gone unseen for so long. As we spoke, her voice carried the gentlest tremor, like someone accustomed to being interrupted mid-thought. She answered carefully, choosing words as if each one weighed something. I noticed how she avoided meeting my gaze for more than a brief second, yet in those seconds I felt an unexpected pull, an echo of my own solitude. There was sadness there, yes, but also resilience, finely stitched into the way she held her shoulders. I found myself wanting to know what stories had shaped that quiet strength, what burdens she carried behind the soft composure she never boasted about. The longer we talked, the more certain I became that she was the person I had been searching for, though not for the reasons I had planned. Something in her presence softened the estate's heavy silence within me, as if her very existence reminded me that life still held mysteries worth uncovering. I sensed that choosing her would change more than the future of my home. It would shift the course of my own heart in ways I could not yet name. And as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting her in a warm glow, one thought became impossible to ignore. This woman, quiet as she was, might hold the key to everything I had never dared to hope for. When I finally gathered the courage to speak my proposal aloud, the words felt heavier than I expected, as if each syllable carried the weight of every unmade choice in my life. She listened quietly, her hands folded together, her breath measured and careful. For a moment I feared I had misread her entirely. Then she lifted her gaze, and in that single glance, I understood the depth of her uncertainty. She accepted, softly, almost reluctantly, yet her voice trembled with something more complex than simple agreement. It wasn't my offer that frightened her. It was the possibility of stepping into a life she had never imagined she deserved. As we walked along the edge of the fields, I sensed shadows moving behind her silence. She kept glancing at the horizon, as if checking whether the world she knew was still there, or whether this new path was already pulling her too far away from it. I asked if she had any doubts, and her smile, gentle but strained, answered for her. There were things she wasn't ready to say, truths tucked behind the careful pauses between her words. Her acceptance came wrapped in a kind of fragility that made me want to protect her, even though I barely understood what she had endured. Whatever her past held, it had taught her to measure trust slowly. Yet even in her hesitation, there was a quiet courage that drew me closer. She did not escape the conversation, nor seek reassurances I could not give. She stood there, steady in her fear, choosing a future woven with uncertainties rather than the familiar ache she carried. And as we parted that evening, I realized her silence was not emptiness. It was armor, lightly worn, but deeply needed. I walked back to the estate, knowing that this agreement, fragile as it was, would reshape both our lives in ways neither of us could foresee. And beneath that certainty lingered a question that would not leave me. What secrets lay behind her guarded eyes? Our wedding took place on a grey morning when the sky seemed unsure whether to bless us with sun or hide behind clouds. The ceremony was simple. No musicians, no lavish decorations, no eager crowd waiting to witness a union. Just a modest chapel, a quiet minister, and the faint scent of candles burned earlier that day. As we stood side by side, her hands folded neatly before her, I felt a strange blend of calm and ache settle in my chest. Marriage, they say, marks a beginning. Yet for me it felt like standing at the edge of an hourglass already half emptied. Still, when she whispered her vows, something inside me steadied. I spoke my own vows with a voice that carried more truth than strength. I promised her respect, security, and the shelter of a home I hoped she would one day call her own. But I could not promise her years, not with certainty. The ring felt cool in my hand as I slid it onto her finger. The gesture both intimate and distant, as though we were stepping into a story neither of us fully understood yet. When the minister declared us husband and wife, she released a trembling breath, almost imperceptible, but enough to remind me that we both carried fears we had not dared to speak aloud. Afterward, we walked out into the open air, where the wind brushed gently against her veil, lifting it for a moment as if trying to see the woman beneath. No cheers greeted us, only the quiet rustling of leaves and the echo of steps on old stone. She looked at the path ahead with cautious wonder, and I found myself studying her face, searching for any sign of regret. Instead, I saw only resolve, soft but unmistakable. And as we made our way back to the estate, side by side yet still distant, I wondered how two strangers, bound by necessity, might learn to share a life shaped by time I feared would vanish too soon. When she crossed the threshold of the estate as its new mistress, the house seemed to inhale, slow, hesitant, as though unsure of how to receive her. I watched from a distance as she explored each hallway with quiet curiosity, her fingertips grazing wooden banisters worn by generations. She paused, often, not out of uncertainty, but as if listening to something only she could hear. The way her gaze lingered on the old portraits made me wonder whether she was searching for fragments of a past she had lost or dreaming of a future she didn't yet trust. In her silence, the estate found a new kind of stillness, expectant, almost hopeful. Rooms that had long felt dormant awakened beneath her presence. She stopped in my father's study, longer than anywhere else, her eyes tracing the shelves as though reading the stories the walls refused to tell. A faint warmth seemed to return to the room, as if her quiet strength coaxed life back into forgotten corners. Even the workers, usually reserved in their routines, softened around her, their greetings warmer, their steps lighter. I noticed these shifts as one notices the change in seasons, not sudden, but undeniably real. It unsettled me and comforted me in equal measure, revealing just how deeply the house echoed my own uncertainties. Yet it was the way she walked the grounds that lingered with me most. She moved as though the land itself spoke to her, pausing at the orchard, the stables, the small garden where my mother once planted lilies. I found myself watching her from windows I rarely approached, wondering what thoughts stirred behind her composed expression. Something in her had begun to blend with the estate's quiet soul, weaving her presence into its walls with a gentleness I had not expected. And as I observed these subtle transformations, one question grew heavier in my chest. What would happen to us? This house, this fragile bond, when the truths we hadn't spoken finally surfaced. I began noticing the changes not through grand gestures, but through the softest of details, the kind easily missed unless one is quietly searching for them. She opened the curtains in rooms I had long allowed to remain dim, letting the morning light spill across the floors like a forgotten blessing. Fresh flowers began appearing in hallways I seldom walked, their colors breathing life into the estate's muted tones. Even the air felt different when she passed, carrying a subtle calm that settled gently around those near her. I found myself listening for the sound of her steps, though I pretended not to notice. The library, once a place of disarray and untouched shelves, slowly transformed under her patient care. Books stood straighter, dust lifted from corners, and the long-forgotten fireplace glowed softly in the evenings. I caught her humming once, a quiet, tender melody, as she arranged a stack of old journals, and the sound lingered with me long after she left the room. The workers responded to her with a respect I had rarely seen, meeting her instructions with warm nods and grateful smiles. Somehow, without ever asserting authority, she had woven herself into the rhythm of the estate with a natural grace I had never managed. It wasn't until one afternoon, when she did not appear in the garden as I had grown used to, that I realized how instinctively I sought her presence. I walked the grounds with a strange impatience, searching the windows for her silhouette, listening for her voice carried on the breeze. When I finally found her in the orchard, speaking kindly to a young worker who looked troubled, something shifted gently inside me. The distance between us, once structured, necessary, intentional, had begun to dissolve without my permission. And as evening settled around us, I felt the estate watching, quietly aware that this change had only just begun. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the sort that usually drifts by unnoticed. I was reviewing estate accounts in my study when a sudden wave of weakness overtook me. The numbers blurred, the room dimmed, and before I could steady myself, the world tilted. I grasped the edge of the desk, but my strength slipped away faster than my breath. When I opened my eyes again, she was kneeling beside me, her hands trembling slightly as they steadied my shoulders. Her voice, usually so soft, held a firmness I had never heard before. In that moment, her presence became the only anchor holding me to the fading edges of consciousness. She insisted I rest, guiding me toward the chaise with surprising determination. I could feel the fear beneath her composure, a fear she tried hard to conceal behind carefully chosen words. She stayed by my side, refusing to leave even when I told her I simply needed time. As she placed a cool cloth against my forehead, I saw a different side of her, protective, vigilant, almost resolute. It struck me then how deeply she had woven herself into the fabric of my days without my noticing. Her concern was not loud or dramatic, but it carried a weight that settled gently over my heart. When the spell finally passed, I found her still watching me, her eyes filled with a quiet worry that reached deeper than politeness. I realized how much my illness frightened her, not because of the estate or the future, but because the fragile connection growing between us now held meaning for her as well. Something in me softened, loosening a knot I had carried for months. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her the truth I had long avoided, that time felt shorter now, yes, but somehow less lonely. And as the light faded from the room, I sensed a shift, subtle, undeniable, pulling us toward a confession neither of us was ready to speak. That evening, after the weakness had passed, we found ourselves seated near the library's glowing hearth, the fire casting soft shadows along the shelves she had so carefully restored. She sat quietly at first, hands folded in her lap, as if weighing a secret she had carried for far too long. Then, in a hesitant breath, she began to speak of her past, a childhood of being overlooked, years spent in houses where her voice held little worth, and moments when she felt more like an obligation than a person. Her words were gentle, but they carried the weight of someone who had learned to survive by growing small within herself. I listened, struck by the quiet bravery it took to reveal such wounds. As she spoke, something inside me stirred, not pity, but recognition. Her loneliness echoed my own, shaped differently yet carved from the same ache. When her voice faltered, I confessed the truth I had guarded more fiercely than my illness. My deepest fear was not dying, but dying without ever being truly known. I admitted how easily I had allowed my life to become a series of duties, how rarely I had allowed anyone close enough to see the softer edges of my heart. She looked at me then, truly looked, with a tenderness that made the room shift around us. For the first time, I felt seen, not as an heir, a landowner, or a fading man, but as myself. A fragile stillness settled between us, not uncomfortable, but charged with something unspoken. An understanding, perhaps, or the faint beginnings of trust. The fire crackled softly, warming the space where our worlds had begun to intertwine. She reached for the book on the table, brushing my hand by accident, and the simple touch sent a ripple through me I could not ignore. It felt as though the house itself breathed differently, sensing the change unfolding within its walls. And as the night deepened, I knew that neither of us would return to who we had been before this moment, because some truths, once shared, refused to fade quietly. It began with subtle shifts in the way people greeted us, polite smiles that lingered a fraction too long, questions wrapped in compliments, and glances that carried more curiosity than warmth. Rumors travel quickly in the countryside, especially when a quiet woman suddenly becomes mistress of a long-standing estate. I overheard whispers in the village about her past, stories embellished by those who had nothing better to do than fill silence with speculation. Even the workers, loyal as they were, exchanged uncertain looks when they thought I wasn't watching. The air grew heavy with judgments born from ignorance, and each whisper felt like a stone placed gently upon her shoulders. The situation worsened when distant relatives arrived under the guise of concern. They questioned her with courteous tones sharpened by suspicion, examining her as though she were an intruder rather than my wife. They asked how we met, why I married so quickly, what intentions she carried behind her calm demeanor. Their words were coated in sweetness, yet the implications stung. I could see her shrinking inward, retreating behind the quiet armor she had worn for years. She answered them politely, never defensive, but the tremor in her hands betrayed the effort it took to remain composed in the face of such scrutiny. Their doubts seeped into the house, unsettling the fragile peace we had begun to build. Even I'm ashamed to admit, felt uncertainty creep along the edges of my mind, not about her character, but about how much pain my decision had brought upon her. She moved through the estate with gentler steps, as if afraid to disturb a balance she no longer trusted. Yet beneath her graceful restraint, I sensed a quiet heartbreak, the kind caused not by unkindness, but by misunderstanding. And as I watched her endure these shadows with silent dignity, one truth pressed painfully against my chest. Protecting her would require far more than vows spoken in a quiet chapel. In the days that followed the rumors, I watched her move through the estate with a grace that humbled me. Instead of retreating, she simply breathed deeper, grounding herself with quiet determination. One morning, when I approached her expecting hesitation or fear, I found her standing in the garden, fixing a broken trellis with steady hands. She looked up at me with a calm I did not expect and said, almost gently, that she would not run from a life she had already begun to build. Her words carried no defiance, only clarity. And in that moment I understood that she was choosing not just the estate, but me. Her resolve became an anchor, I hadn't known I was missing. At dinners, she sat beside me with serene composure, her silence speaking louder than any defense she could have offered. When relatives lingered too long with their pointed questions, she met their glances with a softness that did not waver. She tended to the workers, visited the villagers, and carried herself as though the whispers that circled her had no power to define her place here. Watching her, I felt something shift inside me. A quiet admiration blooming into something deeper, something dangerously close to devotion. One evening, as we walked along the path behind the orchards, I thanked her for her strength. She stopped, turning to me with a tenderness that unsettled me more than any accusation ever had. She told me she stayed because leaving would mean surrendering to a life where she remained unseen, unheard, forgotten. Here, even in discomfort, she felt herself becoming more than a shadow. Her honesty struck me with surprising force. I realized then how deeply her presence steadied the spaces within me I had long neglected. And as we walked back toward the estate, side by side in growing twilight, I sensed that the next turn in our story was already gathering just beyond the horizon. The storm arrived without warning, sweeping across the fields like a tide of restless shadows. I felt the first signs of my weakness returning as thunder rolled over the hills, my breath shortening in a way I could no longer ignore. She found me in the corridor, my hand pressed against the wall for support, and without hesitation, she guided me to the sitting room where the fire still glowed faintly. Rain battered the windows as she knelt beside me, her eyes wide with fear she tried to mask. In that fragile moment, the distance between us vanished, replaced by the raw truth of our shared vulnerability. I confessed more than I intended, how every passing day felt borrowed, how the uncertainty of my body weighed heavier than any estate I could inherit. My voice broke on words I had held back for months, and instead of turning away, she took my trembling hand in hers. She spoke softly of her own fears, of losing the first place where she had ever felt welcomed, of watching me suffer with no power to help, of caring for someone far more deeply than she ever expected. Her honesty cut through the storm like a single beam of light, revealing emotions both of us had been hiding behind politeness and duty. As the wind howled outside, something unnamed settled quietly between us. She rested her head against my shoulder, not seeking comfort, but offering it, the kind that speaks without words. I felt a warmth gather where her hand held mine, a warmth that steadied the trembling inside me. Love was too bold a word to speak aloud then, yet it hovered in the quiet, unspoken, but unmistakable. When the storm finally began to fade, neither of us moved, afraid to break the fragile truth that had found its way into the room. And I knew, with sudden clarity, that nothing would ever return to the way it was before this night. In the weeks after the storm, I noticed a strange shift in my body. Subtle at first, like a whisper I wasn't sure I heard correctly. The heaviness in my chest eased, the trembling in my hands faded, and mornings no longer greeted me with the same familiar fatigue. I kept these changes to myself, afraid to name them, as though acknowledging them aloud might break whatever fragile grace had been given to me. Yet each day I found new strength where weakness once lived. I walked farther, breathed deeper, stood taller. It was as if time itself had loosened its grip, offering me a reprieve I never expected. I caught her watching me with cautious hope, her eyes tracing the ease returning to my movements. She didn't ask, not at first, but I could feel her silent questions in the way she lingered near doorways, studying me as if trying to memorize the shape of this unexpected miracle. And I, too, found myself questioning everything. Was it fate, mercy, or the simple power of being no longer alone? I wondered if the doctor had been mistaken, or if my heart had begun fighting again for reasons neither science nor logic could explain. The uncertainty frightened me nearly as much as my illness once had. One morning, as sunlight spilled across the terrace, I realized I was no longer thinking in terms of months, but of seasons, of possibilities that stretched beyond the narrow confines of a single year. It unsettled me, this sudden expansion of the future, because hope can be its own kind of risk. What did it mean for us, for the life we were slowly, cautiously weaving together? I felt a tremor of fear and wonder intertwine within me, forming a question I could not yet voice. And as she joined me at the railing, her presence warm beside mine, I sensed that the next chapter of our story would demand a courage neither of us had fully discovered yet. The first sign of change came quietly, almost shyly, like all meaningful things in our lives seem to. One morning, she placed a hand over mine at breakfast, her expression softened by something new, something delicate yet profound. She spoke of hope, not in grand declarations, but in small, trembling words. Whether it was the possibility of a child, a shared project, or simply the renewal of the estate through our joined efforts, I could not tell. But I felt the shift immediately, a spark growing in the space between us. Whatever form our legacy would take, it was no longer just mine. It was ours, woven from two hearts once fractured by silence. As the days passed, the estate itself reflected our transformation. The workers moved with renewed purpose, the fields flourished, and the halls echoed with a warmth I had not heard since childhood. She tended to everything with a tenderness that stitched new life into old bones, mine included. I found myself meeting her in the garden without meaning to, drawn by an invisible pull stronger than duty. In her smile, I saw the beginnings of a future I had never dared imagine. And when she rested her head against my shoulder one afternoon, the gesture felt like a quiet promise, one that settled deeper than any vow spoken at our modest wedding. It was then, in a still moment beneath the orchard trees, that I understood the truth I had been circling for weeks. She had healed more than this house. She had healed me. Not with grand gestures or declarations, but through presence, patience, and the gentle certainty that I was no longer walking through life alone. A legacy had indeed begun, not only in the estate's revival, but in the fragile, fierce bond we had nurtured together. And as I looked at her, framed by branches heavy with spring blossoms, I sensed that the final chapter of our story was approaching, one that would reshape everything we believed about love, fate, and the time we thought we had lost. There are mornings now when I wake before the sun, not because of fear or trembling, but because the world feels strangely full again. I step onto the terrace and breathe in the quiet air, thinking of the man I was when all this began. A man resigned to endings, to loneliness, to the narrow path laid before him. I hardly recognize him anymore. She changed the rhythm of my days without demanding anything in return. She offered presence where I had expected distance, understanding where I had feared pity. In her steadiness, I found the courage to hope again, cautiously at first, then fully, as though hope had always been waiting for permission to stay. When I look at her now, moving through the halls she has revived or tending to the garden she reshaped, I see the quiet miracle of being seen, truly seen, not for my heritage or my illness, but for the man hidden beneath both. She taught me that time is not counted only by the hours we are given, but by the depth with which we choose to live them. I once believed my life was narrowing toward its final page, yet here I stand, pages unfolding still, each one shaped by choices I never believed myself brave enough to make. And in every one of them, I find her, steady, patient, luminous. I no longer fear the hourglass. Its sands fall as they always have, but they no longer dictate the shape of my days. Instead, they remind me that life is not measured by length, but by presence, by the hearts we allow to walk beside ours. When I take her hand now, I feel the echo of all we survived and all we might still become. Perhaps fate was never ending my story, but rewriting it through her. And as we stand together beneath the settling light, I sense a truth whispering gently at the edges of our future, that love, once chosen freely, can carry us far beyond the time we thought we had.